society is like sheep. Okay? The police officers are the sheepdogs, and then criminals are the wolves, right? In doing that, you're already kind of putting yourselves like above the everyday citizen. You're not the same as everyday citizens.
All right, welcome back to Lawish. Today, we're going to talk about the second part of a conversation we had last week. And as a reminder, we were talking about blind denial as a concept. And within this concept, we have three different aspects that we wanted to discuss separately. The first one, which is what we talked about last week, was cognitive dissonance. The second one, which we're going to be talking about today, is dehumanization. And the third one is evil administration. So that one's going to be for a future episode. But the reason we want to talk about this today is because it also touches within the overarching concept of blind denial, which is chapter, I think, 2 of the book. Is we want to break these apart individually because there's a whole blind denial. You can talk about it almost like on a surface level, but we thought it warranted discussing these three components one at a time in relatively short episodes, but in a way that at least gives them a little bit more attention so you can get a better grasp of the concept overall. Now, a reminder, a big portion of it is coming from the book of Professor Mark Godsey, Blind Injustice. The links are going to be in the description below for the audiobook or the actual physical book if you guys want to follow along. But you don't really need it. If you want it, it's great. It's a great read. We recommend you get it. We just kind of take that, go through Professor Godsey's experiences, and then we discuss based on our knowledge of the topic. So just a word of advice. I am going through a cold. So if you hear like just random, I'm going to try and keep the sniffles and coughing my lungs out to a minimum and away from the microphone. But just bear with us on that. Jeff, let's talk dehumanization.
Dehumanization is a big part of blind denial. It's, throughout society in general, all professions and people in general, but it's really prevalent in the legal field. And here it's important because it ultimately is a factor that leads to wrongful convictions. It's essentially just the process of stripping somebody's humanity away from them, where you no longer kind of have them in your moral conscience. You see them as being lesser. They're not people. They're not worthy of your empathy, your sympathy, or at least to not the same extent as somebody else.
They become just like numbers or statistics to you.
And you've psychology, they always talk about in groups and out groups is kind of usually how it's associated. And the in group is groups that you associate with, whether it's based on race or police. You're a police and you're a member of this group, or you're a prosecutor, you're a member, the group, whatever the group is.
Yeah, whatever you consider your peers at the time. It could be your job profession, your career, your teachers hang out with teachers, lawyers hang out with lawyers, law enforcement people hang out with law enforcement, or tend to kind of gravitate towards that. It's birds of a feather, right?
Yeah, exactly. So you have some sort of bias here, at least where you see yourself as setting yourself apart, whatever that identifier is, from another group, the out group.
Yeah. And
it plays in here, and you see it, again, with prosecutors, with police, you see it with judges, you see it with even defense attorneys, you see it in all areas of the legal field. The main two areas, and obviously with Godsey talks about his own experiences in chapter 2, is his experience as a prosecutor and he himself going through this process and not really realizing he was doing it at the time. It wasn't until really he reflected on this later on that it really kind of hit, to the extent that he was doing this. Prosecutors do it and police do it, and again, defense attorneys do it, judges do it, and they do it for a reason it's really self-preservation. It's a way to continue doing the job without having this super heavy burden on you. Because if you realized your job and what you were doing, saying you're arresting people and you're throwing them in jail, or you're sending them to jail if you're a prosecutor and you're a judge, and they're getting convicted, and you're taking their freedom away from them. Well, it's easier to do that if you don't see them as being human, or you don't see them at least as the same level, care about them as to the same level as you would a member of the in-group, right. Somebody else, like a friend or family member. And so it's done, I think, in a lot of levels subconsciously. You don't even really realize you're doing it, but you do it as a way, really just to protect yourself. And you see it with prosecutors. Again, Godsey talks about cases that he had. He had 2 clients, or actually it was 3 co-defendants, 2 that became cooperating witnesses. And so it was kind of this dynamic where all 3 of them committed this crime. But he had two that were cooperating, who were helping the police, who were helping, obviously him, ultimately convict the third. And in, exchange for that, they were going to get a much less significant sentence, right, for their cooperation. Well, he saw them during this process as being essentially, they were just people who were, poor. They were just basically a victim of their circumstances that led them to commit this crime. But then he saw the other person who wasn't a cooperating witness, who did the same crime they did, as being this kind of terrible person. He, in his mind, was like, he must have been the ringleader. He's really responsible for it. He must have coerced them to ultimately go along with it. They wouldn't have probably done it otherwise. And so it allowed him to kind of, again, pull those two things apart and be like, these people are helping me. They're benefiting me. Therefore, they are somehow different than this individual. And
that kind of ties, with last week's discussion, which was by dehumanizing someone, you are effectively trying to harmonize that cognitive dissonance that you have,
yes.
right? Because you were saying, it's easier for you to do your job, and we talked about cognitive dissonance and about how sometimes you have that resistance to think that someone is innocent when your job was to get them in jail because you had already formed an opinion that they were guilty.
Yeah.
And it touches a little bit on that is the resolution to cognitive dissonance comes at times in the form of dehumanizing someone to allow you to do your job, to allow you to escape or resolve that dissonance. And in this case that you were explaining, you're rationalizing, I'm working with criminals,
mm-hmm.
but they were the lesser evil. They were either coerced or they didn't know they didn't know better. The other guy was the guy that I'm trying to get in jail. That was the guy that did it. That was the guy that was really the culprit.
Yes. And the irony is, and this is from my own work as being a defense attorney in the past.
Mine too.
Yeah, it's so bad that you could have the same individual who's playing a different role that is now benefiting a different side. So you'll have one day where I'm representing an individual as a defendant, right? And the prosecutor is like, it's a horrible person. They need to go to jail. What they did was terrible. You can't believe them. Look at them. They committed crimes. They're a criminal. But then the next day, which is often the case, not the next day, but later on, they're a victim. They're a prosecuting witness in another case. Then the prosecutor wants to put them forward and say they're the most reliable, believable person out there, And so
this person's character is without reproach.
Exactly. And they start buying into it, though. Like they now see this person as being of some sort of higher level of, trustworthiness and, being worthy of sympathy and all this other stuff when, maybe a month prior, it was the exact opposite. And it's because now it's a different capacity. And it, again, to that, the whole cognitive dissonance, as well as, them trying to essentially protect their own, I guess, mental well-being. They do this, whether or not they're really realizing they're doing it or not. It's certainly not just, prosecutors, but yeah, he uses this case really just to give an example of that. And it really hits when it comes to the actual trial. He sees the defendant there, the one who's not cooperating, and there's nobody there to support him. And and Godsey talks about usually there's family members and friends there to support these individuals. There was nobody there. Well, I'll tell you that's normally not the case. Now on his level it probably was, because this is like higher level stuff. There probably is, but in the common pleas and municipal, a lot of times there's nobody there. There's because ultimately they just don't have anybody. That's kind of the reality. But in this situation, there wasn't anybody there. And it really hit him because it was a young kid, he was a young teenager. I think he was 18, but still. And it made him feel some type of way and really start seeing him as a young kid. And then in his head, he's like, kind of starting to pull apart that dissonance and see, okay, well, these two people really aren't that different from this individual.
So they're all the individual elements instead of the whole thing that is not,
yes.
is not jiving in your head.
And so not seeing anybody there to support him kind of played into the narrative that he gave to the cooperating witnesses who are, they were just victims of their circumstances, and he's like, well, this guy has nobody, so it was hard for that to really kind of pry those apart then. And he started then empathizing with this individual. And so trial came around. Obviously it was the day of the trial, but when the trial actually started, I guess one of his witnesses that was supposed to testify was not going to anymore. And he talks about how he used that as an opportunity to basically just tried to push a really good plea so that this guy didn't ultimately get potentially 30 years is what he was facing. And he ultimately ended up getting 10 years. And, that was his way to kind of really just, I guess, feel better about the whole situation. It still didn't sit with him well because these other cooperating witnesses got 2 years for doing the same thing. Now, ultimately, he brings it up again later on because he runs into one of the cooperating witnesses later on in court on some sort of different case. And, he's not a defendant in that situation. He's just in the courtroom, supporting somebody else. And he's talking about how he turned his life around. He got his high school diploma in prison, and now he's in college on a baseball scholarship.
Nice.
And so it was great. But then in his head, he's like, well, what was different about him than the guy that did a decade?
Yeah, could this other guy maybe also have gotten the same benefits out of it, but now he's staying in jail 5 times more than the cooperating witnesses.
So it started to allow him to really kind of realize that he was dehumanizing, these individuals. And you see it all the time. I saw it all the time with prosecutors, and and sometimes it's even, I don't really know if they did this crime, but they're criminals anyway, and you see that with the police. The police is the same way, and they're trained from the academy. The first thing they do when they get to the academy is watch videos about police getting murdered. So from the get-go, they're seeing citizens killing police officers. And then the next thing they learn is how to use lethal force and what the threshold is. So it's like, okay, it's, what does a reasonable police officer think in that situation? Well, they just put in your head that pretty much you saw nothing but videos of cops getting murdered, and like traffic stops and a lot of mundane stuff. So then you're already starting to associate the everyday citizen, especially minorities, with being a threat.
With danger, yeah.
And the very next thing you're trained with is when can you kill them, right? And a big proponent of is a police officer himself, but he really kind of pushes this narrative, which a lot of the police training kind of focuses on, is this like hierarchy essentially where they see society. It's like a way to kind of like view police officers where society is like sheep. Okay, the police officers are the sheep dogs, and then criminals are the wolves, right? So in doing that, you're already kind of putting yourselves against above the everyday citizen because you're there to protect them. You're not the same as everyday citizens, but you're also you're fighting these evil kind of the wolves, which are the criminals. And it sets up.
They can also be in wolves in sheep's clothing.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Instead of wolves in the sheep's clothing or skin, right?
That's what it is. So that already is kind of already distinguishing that whole in-group, out-group, dehumanizing, seeing them as different kind of categories. That combined with, again, a lot of these videos they're not only will they play these videos, but they'll also say like, stuff that it's like you'll never know what to expect. You could be no traffic stop is routine. And like somebody could jump out of the trunk with an AK-47. It's like, of course that could happen. But let's be honest, the reality and statistically, the chance that happens is very little.
Yeah.
But they start believing that it happens a lot because all they're seeing is videos of it happening all the fucking time. Mm-hmm. So they go out there, new cops go out there with this mentality. They're already on edge, right? And then they're assuming everybody essentially that looks like these individuals in the video are a threat from the get-go. And it's like, but yeah, you see it. It's just the academy sets these people up to already think this way. And then through their experience, it only gets worse because they're already on edge. And then again, this is a whole nother thing we don't have time to talk about in this episode. But, systemically, gentrification, they're responding in hotspots, which are high minority areas because of socioeconomic status. And so then they start feeling that minorities are a threat based on their experiences in the high crime areas, which are high population minorities. And it just plays into that.
And it becomes a vicious circle, too. Yeah. And oftentimes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because if you're already on edge on some of these places, even without, I don't want to say without justification, but without justification in the moment, in the context, then there's more, at risk of oversimplifying, there's more risk of you being trigger happy or feeling, my life is, in danger when it really isn't.
Yeah.
Right? Or I guess misjudging, having tunnel vision, other things that we're going to talk about later on. So it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy that just becomes a vicious circle as well.
Yeah, and so that's when you get like the person's reaching in their pocket for like their cell phone,
Right.
And they're like, must be a gun because I saw a video where a cop got killed and it was a gun.
There was some silver or metallic glistening that I
Yeah.
saw from coming out of the pocket, automatically a gun.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah.
Just thought it was a cell phone or a lighter or whatever.
And it's not, obviously there's racist cops just like there's racist anybody in any profession, but the large majority, it's not the case. It's just the circumstances of the system and how it's set up and everything else that makes them that way. And we know that statistically, there's very little difference between African American police officers and white officers in outcomes. And so it's like that's not the problem. The problem is much bigger than that. But again, that's a whole other thing. But yeah, cops are just as susceptible, if not even more, than prosecutors are.
Well, yeah, and in all fairness, I mean, their profession is
Yeah.
they're facing danger all the time, every day of their lives. So when we talk about law enforcement in this context and how there's their unfortunate and sometimes tragic mistakes based on different biases, it's not a way to demonize them. It happens more often because it's a profession that is more often exposed to these kinds of systemic issues.
Yeah, and then again, it's judges as well. But I mean, if you think about it, you almost have to for the same reason. If you're a judge and you're going to sentence somebody to jail, to prison, potentially life in prison to death, and there's a possibility, okay, maybe I got this wrong and I'm killing a person or I'm taking somebody's life away. It's a lot easier to do that if you don't see him as a person. You see him as a criminal or some sort of human. It's a lot easier to make those judgment calls and sleep at night.
Yeah.
Whereas it's like, what if it was your friend or family, right? And if it's somebody you treated that way, it would make you think a whole lot differently. So some of it's, I think, necessary to do the job to an extent. But I think it gets problematic when there's too much of it, and it does become just routine. Not the dehumanization, but the stepping away from that where you just, because I think there's a way to realize, I'm going to say that, I want to correct that, because I don't want to say it's okay to dehumanize people. What I'm saying is, like, I think there's a way to go about the reality that you're like, this is the system. And it is the way it is, and it's hard, but it's necessary in circumstances. And he does talk about in his book, there was a judge who, he just wins a big trial. It's Christmas. There's a Christmas party right before Christmas. And he goes in there, he's celebrating. And all the prosecutors are high-fiving him, the FBI agents, everybody's all happy, right? And I guess one of the judges was there, saw this, observed it, and wrote a letter to the office, the U.S. Attorney's office, basically to his bosses, complaining, like, this is so unprofessional. He's like, I don't know why anybody's cheering about people
sending someone to
prison. He's like, it's necessary, yes, but you should never celebrate somebody's, he's talking about the impact it has on their family members and their life and everything else. And that's kind of the point I'm getting across. Like, it is necessary, yes, in some circumstances, obviously, that's why we have the system, but you shouldn't. There's a way to go about that where you're not like celebrating, you're not excited, you're not like, oh yeah, like, and dehumanizing does that. This judge very clearly was able to do the job, but it still made him feel a type of way when he did that.
Yeah.
And that's what you need. You need that humanity because your decisions are doing that ultimately. And same with, you see it with police officers, some who don't, and that still have that in them. I mean, obviously there's probably a lot that don't, that still have that kind of, that they see criminals or suspects as still being people. And you can see it in how they treat them.
But there's a difference between being able to do your job, which is the level that you're talking about, which is being able to have that poise to do your job because your job is to protect people and in the case of judges, to I guess impart justice because that's the justice system. There's a difference between being able to do that and just groveling in someone else's misfortune, right? Or misery or suffering. So I think it goes to that judge's point. It's like one thing. I mean, you're a prosecutor. Your job is to prosecute the case. We talked about defense attorneys. You don't defend someone because you think you're innocent. Mm-hmm. You're defending them to make sure they get a fair shake at a trial, and that if they go to jail, is because the prosecution does its job and is able to prove that you committed a crime. So, and that's a nuance maybe, but that is a reality of the system, right? Is your defense attorney is making sure you get a fair shake.
Yeah.
If you committed the crime, if there's evidence all over the place, if and the prosecution does its job, you're going to jail, right? Your defense attorney is going to try to mitigate as much as they can, but it doesn't mean you're innocent.
Yeah.
Same thing with and this, the imparting justice, and that is what the judge is doing. There's a difference between able to do your job and just being almost like enjoying someone else's suffering.
Yeah.
And then you're letting your job define you.
Exactly.
And obviously there's bad things there's biases that come with the job.
And I will say, hearing that, I was not surprised, obviously, because I saw the same thing, but I also saw the other side of that, which is kind of what you're starting to talk about with defense attorneys. When we won trials, it was the same way. You're excited to come back. You're like, yeah, we won. And yeah, there were cases a lot of times where it was like they shouldn't have been charged, or they were exaggerated or whatever. But there were also cases where, there were, in some way or another, there was a victim, and whether it was, because you have cases where the cops messed up, or, the victim didn't show up and it got dismissed. And yeah, you're happy for your client, but I don't know how many times on DV cases you'll get pictures. Clearly this person was beat up by somebody, right? And they're scared to show up, or they don't want their baby's daddy or whatever the situation is going to jail. So it gets dismissed. And so part of you's happy. You're happy for your client because that's what your job is. You're supposed to advocate for your client. That's the best possible outcome from your client. But the humanity, like the human side of you still sympathize with that individual because especially with DV, the recidivism rate's really high.
Are you potentially sending them back to their home?
Exactly.
In the chance they actually did it.
Yeah.
To continue this conduct.
Yes. And I mean, but at the end of the day, as a defense attorney, that's not your job. The prosecutor brings forward the witnesses. If they don't show up, that's not on you. But when you do have trials, though, and you win because you were just a better litigator, or you're able to poke holes in the evidence they do have, it doesn't always mean your client was innocent. Yeah, they just legally, of course, because they weren't able to prove the case. But but I think, and so for me, that was always kind of in some cases in the back of your head. It's like, okay, well maybe this did happen. I'm not going to go celebrate. Yeah, I'm happy for my client. I'm happy my client's not going to now be caught up in the system if they weren't already. They're not going to have to deal with this, and it's also it feels good because you did your job good. But at the same time, it's you do see the other side of that. And so I think again, like he talks about, that judge is a really important example of what I think we need, where you can still do your job without dehumanizing people.
Yeah.
And again, you do see some cops that do it, but I will say a lot of cops, a lot of prosecutors, and again, judges, and to some extent defense attorneys all do this. And it all plays into, problems we see in obviously wrongful convictions. So,
yeah. But so, for example, right now that you're talking about, when sometimes you have defendants who then become cooperating witnesses, I think it's a good segue into a way to round up the discussion about dehumanization, to talk about witnesses themselves, because that was a specific context. When you have a defendant who becomes a cooperating witness, they have something to gain, obviously, by getting a lesser sentence, like the example that Godsey talks about. But you also have witnesses that have really no skin in the game, or that are themselves victims, but also witness a crime. And they, just to show that everybody is prone to this bias, right, this problem of dehumanization, why don't we talk about instances you've seen of witnesses engaging in this dehumanization behavior?
Now that you say that, I do want to just cover something that I heard in the book, and it just made me think of it now, that I do disagree with Godsey on. And we kind of had been discussing, I guess, a little bit earlier in this episode, but he said that kind of really what made him step away was when he realized that he, I guess to an extent, stopped dehumanizing and seeing these people, and he wasn't able to effectively do his job and enforce the law, because again, a lot of, especially on the U.S. attorney's level, when you have federal level, especially depending on your jurisdiction you have minimum mandatory guidelines, and the judges have to abide by those. And if it's like he wasn't agreeing with the amount of time and this, that, and whatever, he saw that as him not being able to effectively do his job anymore. I would argue that the opposite. I think that's the people we need in those jobs.
Yeah.
I think you need to be morally conflicted when you're, when you're prosecuting, when you're defending to an extent. You need to still obviously give a full defense to your client, but more so with the prosecutors and the judges and the police, which is why all three of those have discretion.
Yeah.
as a defense attorney, you don't have discretion. Your job is to defend your client. But all three of those have discretion because those are the individuals who are taking somebody's life or liberty away. And you should be conflicted because there are conflicting concerns. This is a person. And there's a lot of factors that are at play and a lot of things you should consider before you decide whether or not to, take this individual's kind of liberty or life away from them. And so I think, if anything, that was more of a reason for him to stay as a prosecutor. But I get why he was saying that.
Yeah. And so I guess the point you're trying to make, I'm mansplaining what you're saying. What you're trying to make is, theoretically, there's no downside to humanizing the profession as opposed to dehumanizing it, right?
Yeah.
So keeping that level of humanity in your performance of your job, it's not going to make you any less of an effective performer, but it may actually help the system overall when you are keeping at least in mind that the person on the other side of the table is a human.
Yeah, it'll make you less of an effective performer if your goal is just statistics. If I'm a prosecutor, I need to get convictions, or I'm a police officer, I need to get arrests. But if you actually see what their actual purpose is, you're supposed to serve justice, then yes, that's going to make you way more effective at all of those positions. And that's, again, why all those have discretion. But I think people forget that. And it's because there's so much pressure, which getting into something we'll go into later on, administrative evil, there is a lot of other factors that play into why that is kind of the mindset. But yeah, that was what he talked about, and I just kind of wanted to point that out. But yeah, it's present, and like you said, in witnesses and victims in cases. If the theft case, something was stolen from your store, you're a manager, or you're whatever, and you're going to testify. You hear it all the time. I want them to do the max. I want to throw the book at them,
right.
And it's a lot of it's kind of like retribution. You want your, whatever. You feel like you were wronged and you want to get back at them. But it's in a way that you wouldn't do to somebody that you saw as a human, because a lot of times...
Right, if it was like your relative.
Yeah, and a lot of times people are stealing because they're poor, or maybe they are a drug addict. And for a lot of people, you could see that and you're like, well, yeah, but look what was going on. But in these scenarios, no, they're I don't care, lock them up.
Yeah, it's like that example that you gave about someone, like let's say I'm the owner of a grocery shop, like a small shop, right? A bodega, if you will. Then you have someone come in and steal from you. You feel personally attacked, and when you saw it, so you go there, you like throw the book at them, and they should hang for this, whatever.
Yeah.
And you don't stop to think, well, what led them to do it? And I'm not trying to justify the burglar, the burglarizing of anybody or anywhere, right? But I think it kind of goes to your point is, if you were the family member of that person who did this, and you knew where they come from, you knew what led them to steal, is that whole dilemma of, would you steal a loaf of bread to feed your family, right?
Yeah,
kind of like
exactly.
So I know it's kind of like philosophical, but it's the same thing. If you were the owner and you realize this is like your cousin was the one that was being accused, would you be, unless you have a really bad relationship with your cousin, would you really be as adamant as throwing, to throw the book at them?
Yes.
Because I feel like, at least when it comes to family relationships, you're almost forced to see them as humans because you grew up with them and you have a relationship with them, presumably. But when they're not, when they're strangers, you dehumanize them, and you want the law applied to the fullest extent.
Yeah, and I think what's key there is it's not necessarily not that you implied that you didn't, but like it's not that I wouldn't do this. It's if you're seeing them as a human, you would then really try to understand their circumstances and see what kind of put them there. And that would be in your head. Even if that might not have been how you handled the situation, you could see why they did what they did. And if nothing else, even if you were like, okay, I want to trespass from the store, you wouldn't have that level of just hate, for lack of better words. It's like a resentment and retribution, and it is, and you see it a lot. I saw it. He worked in retail for years, and I saw it all the time. There was that, it wasn't just, we just want them to stay away from the store. Yeah. And especially in the smaller businesses even more. And some of that you can sympathize with because they're trying to provide for their family, and it's directly impacting that.
And from the other side, you also see it because it's like, maybe they're not really angry at the person that did it. They're just like angry at that's the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? So this doesn't mean always turn the other cheek or let everybody steal from you. That's not the point. The point is there are obviously circumstances that happen and that are different in everybody's life, and the problem is when we overlap experiences, we may lose sight of the circumstances going on in each other's lives, right? That lead that person to steal from your store, and that leads you from being just fed up with it and trying to throw the book at them to almost feel vindicated or set an example.
Yeah, and it's I think as it happens more and more, you start dehumanizing each individual more and more. So initially it might happen, and you might talk to the person like, oh well, kind of understand where they're coming from, maybe, or try to understand where they're coming from. But then once you've had your store stolen from 10 times, then everybody that does it, you're like, lock them up, throw the book at them. At that point, you've associated they're a criminal. They're not a person. They're a criminal.
Yeah.
They need to go to jail. They need to stay in jail. Never, whatever. And so it's just like police. The more they do this, prosecutors, the more they do this, usually it just gets worse. Mm-hmm. And you start grouping everybody together. You start and it's also because you've seen it so much. Judges too. You know how many times people go before them, defendants, and then they think everybody's lying to them because they've been lied to a lot. Well, no surprise. I mean, you got people that are their life or liberty is at stake. They're going to say whatever they can to try to get out of it. But then they start believing everybody's a liar. And you see that with prosecutors too.
They're jaded at that point.
Exactly. The irony is what I was talking about before is when your defendant is a different day as a witness on their case, now all of a sudden they believe them, right? It's like that switch in their head. It's just, okay, no, they're trustworthy 100% because we need them to prove the case, But that's where I get I just find it mind-blowing. But yeah, it certainly impacts every part of the justice system and society as a whole. But especially, for context of this, the justice system obviously leads to wrongful convictions for the same reason, because you are a lot less, when you're in those, the prosecutor, the police, and the judge, the jobs where you really have discretion and you're the one that's ultimately kind of putting this person in prison. When you don't see them as a human, you're less likely to kind of step back and think about what you're doing and use discretion in situations where you should. You're a lot less likely to hesitate. Is there enough evidence? Is this? And juries to some extent, I guess, could possibly do this too. But usually in this case, if it's a judge, it's like if you were seeing him as more as a human, you're like, I don't know, maybe I'm not convinced. But if you don't, you're like, who cares? Whatever. Yeah. Especially if they have a rap sheet. Then you're like, well, they're criminals anyway. Yeah. Send them to jail. It doesn't matter.
Send them to jail, even if there's not enough evidence here. It's going to make up for whatever they did do that there was no evidence
exactly,
for.
Or they didn't get caught for.
Yeah.
And you see that with cops all the time, too. Well, they didn't do this one. They did another one. So, it's almost like they had it coming anyway, Yeah. And so it's certainly a huge factor and makes sense, obviously, why he talks about it in the book and really points it out. And it, unfortunately, I think is something that it's not easy to realize you're doing, and it's not something a lot of people would ever admit they're doing, even though it's easy to look on from the outside and be like, well, clearly this is going on,
But it's an easy concept to grasp,
yes,
though, and to understand. So let us know in the comments if, it's going to be hard for anybody to accept this. But let us know in the comments if you have caught yourself kind of taking that position where you're like, either out of spite, out of frustration, out of whatever, try to, not caring what happens to the other person, but because you feel that that's vindication, that is justice, and that in itself could be dehumanizing someone else. Yeah. So it's a random thing, but just let us know in the comments below if you've caught yourself doing that.
And I'll admit, I've certainly done it in some cases too, where it was a prosecuting witness, and just because again, it's kind of the other side of that. You're like, oh, they're liars, yeah, sometimes they are. Yeah. But sometimes they're not. And it's like it's easy to get caught up in that mindset, especially when you have groupthink and you have an entire group of people that you're surrounded by all the time who have that same mentality. Yeah. So yeah, it'd be interesting to see what other people in whatever profession you're in, or just in general outside of your profession, if that's ever really happened to you without you really thinking about it, just kind of reflecting on it.
Yeah. We talked about obviously how this happens in the judicial system. Lawyers, witnesses, judges, law enforcement. You know of other industries, where this happens, where you've witnessed it. Even if you haven't done it yourself, let us know in the comments. That'll be interesting to know. because maybe we can even look into how, like, what is the context in which dehumanizing happens in different industries, because we're attuned to the judicial system one. And we may be missing in some of the places.
Another quick example is like just with cops and drug addicts. If they're overdosing, like, oh, it's a drug addict anyway. Well, a lot of paramedics are like that too. They get to a point where they just stop caring because they're like, oh, he's just on drugs, and they get so annoyed with having to come out for calls and Narcan people, and it's like, obviously, when you get to a point where you're like, you don't really care if that person dies because they're a drug addict, you dehumanize them as much as you can. Yeah. And so I've heard it from people that I know who are paramedics, unfortunately, who made jokes about it. And yeah, it's definitely more than just the justice system. But it'd be interesting to hear what other examples people have, even if it's not you, examples that maybe you've seen other people or stories they've told you, and not obviously admitting that they were doing this, but where it was clear that's what was going on.
Yeah.
So
definitely let us know in the comments below. Again, the book we're reviewing, for the next couple of episodes, because we think all these concepts are really interesting, is Blind Injustice by Professor Mark Godsey. The link to the book is going to be in the description. Also, the title cards are going to appear at some point in the video, linking to that original interview that we had with Professor Godsey. It's a really cool interview, and you should check it out. That kind of kicked off this series of videos on innocence projects and just the wrongful convictions topic. So check it out. Any parting words, Jeff?
No, I'll just say it's going to get, if anything, it's just going to get more interesting. So definitely stay tuned. Yeah,
don't forget to subscribe, like the video, share with your friends, or follow us on TikTok.
Yeah.
We have a TikTok now. I'll leave the link as well in the description so you can follow us there too. We put little snippets of these videos, snippets of just random interesting stuff that we have talked about either in the channel or that we will talk about later. Sometimes there's like news that can be shared in a minute, so we do that too. So that's going to be a cool source of information as well. Follow that. I'll put the link in the description. Well then, thank you for joining us again for another discussion. We'll see you next week. This was Lawish.
Yeah.
Yeah, boy.